Tonight, we step into a Britain that forgot it was history, where silence replaced empire, and ordinary lives carried on while the world quietly slipped into shadow without witnesses watching. Before you drift any deeper, if this quiet helps you feel safe tonight, you're welcome to stay with us. Subscribing softly keeps this place gentle and lets these nights continue. Now, rest. And now let the story begin the way it truly did. Not with fire raining from the sky, not with a final speech delivered beneath collapsing marble, not with heroes standing defiantly as the credits roll. There was no moment you could frame and call the end. In Britain, Rome did not fall. It did something far less cinematic and far more unsettling. It gathered what still belonged to it. It closed ledgers. It recalled soldiers. It stopped answering letters. And then quietly, almost apologetically, it left. No alarms were sounded. No one came to turn off the lights. Rome didn't die here. Rome simply packed its bags and went home. Sometime in the early 5th century, the Roman administration looked at this cold, distant island and decided it was no longer worth the trouble. The legions were needed elsewhere. The money was needed elsewhere. The attention was needed elsewhere. And Britain, muddy, damp, endlessly complaining Britain, was quietly crossed off the list. No announcement was made for the people living there. No ceremony marked the end of nearly 4 centuries of Roman rule. The empire did not slam the door. It just stopped answering emails. Imagine waking up one morning in a world that still looks exactly the same as yesterday. The same stone streets stretch under your feet. The same public buildings loom over the town square. The same baths stand silent, their tiles cracked but intact. And yet something essential is gone. Not broken, not destroyed, just absent, like electricity after a storm. The lights are still there. The wires remain in the walls, but nothing turns on. Roman Britain became a place where infrastructure outlived authority. Roads built to last centuries continued to cut through the countryside straight and stubborn, long after the men who planned them were gone. Towns remained standing, their walls unbreached, their gates still swinging in the wind. But there was no one left to organize repairs, no one to collect taxes to fund them, no one to issue orders that anyone was obligated to obey. Civilization did not explode. It slowly forgot how it worked. For the people living there, this was not the fall of Rome. That phrase would not exist for another 1,000 years. To them, it was simply a strange quiet. Soldiers stopped marching through town. Officials stopped showing up. Coins became harder to find. The familiar rhythm of empire, so constant it had felt like nature itself, began to stutter. And when it stopped completely, there was no dramatic moment to point to, just a growing sense that the world had changed and no one had asked permission. Rome had brought with it a promise, order, laws written down, disputes settled by courts instead of fists, roads that led somewhere, systems that connected villages to towns, towns to cities, cities to something larger than themselves. And now that promise expired without notice. The empire didn't collapse under its own weight here. It simply decided Britain was someone else's problem. Rome didn't die. Rome logged out. What makes this moment unsettling is not violence, but continuity. The buildings still stood. The streets still existed. The skeleton of Roman life remained intact, but the muscles were gone. Britain, after Rome, became a museum with no visitors and no staff. You could walk through the remains of a highly organized world while living a life that was rapidly becoming disorganized. It is one thing to lose civilization in flames. It is another to lose it while the signs are still hanging. For decades, people continued to live among the leftovers of empire. They repaired Roman houses using Roman stones. They reused Roman tools until they broke beyond fixing. They told stories of Rome as something both familiar and distant, like remembering a parent who had moved away and never called. Children grew up surrounded by structures built for a world they would never fully understand. A bathhouse is a strange place if you've never seen it used. This was not the Dark Ages yet. Not officially. Darkness implies a sudden absence of light. What Britain experienced was more like dusk, a long, slow fading. The sun did not vanish. It sank gradually while people went about their lives, hoping morning would come as it always had. And at first, it did. Crops still grew. Families still formed. Markets still existed, though smaller and poorer. Life continued, stubbornly ordinary, but something subtle had shifted. Without Roman authority, there was no longer a shared framework holding everything together. The law became local. Power became personal. Protection became something you negotiated rather than expected. If a road broke, it stayed broken. If a bridge collapsed, it became a problem for whoever lived nearby, not for a distant administrator with a budget and a blueprint. The idea of public service quietly died of neglect. It is tempting to imagine people panicking when Rome left. They did not. Panic requires clarity, and this was anything but clear. The end of empire did not feel like an ending. It felt like inconvenience layered on inconvenience, small failures accumulating until they became normal. A town council meeting that never happened, a repair that never came, a soldier who did not return. The world did not scream. It whispered repeatedly, until silence felt natural. There is something darkly humorous about it, in hindsight. Rome, the most powerful empire the Western world had ever known, withdrew from Britain not because it was conquered, but because it was inconvenient, no epic defeat, no tragic last stand, just strategic disinterest. An empire spanning continents decided this island wasn't worth the expense of keeping the lights on, and the lights went out. Not all at once, but one by one, unnoticed. For the people left behind, the familiar became unreliable. Coins lost their value when there were fewer places to spend them. Written contracts mattered less when there was no authority to enforce them. Literacy declined not because people suddenly hated reading, but because reading was no longer useful. If your world shrinks, your skills shrink with it. Knowledge that once connected you to an empire became excess weight in a village focused on survival. And yet, this was not a story of immediate despair. People adapted because people always do. They reused what they could. They simplified their lives. They leaned on kinship instead of bureaucracy. But adaptation does not mean progress. It often means narrowing. Britain after Rome became smaller in every sense. Economically, politically, psychologically. The world beyond the horizon mattered less because there was no longer a system that reached that far. This is where the unease lives. Not in chaos, but in familiarity without function. Imagine living in a city built for tens of thousands, now occupied by a few hundred. Echoes in the streets, empty forums, walls designed to defend against armies that no longer come. The past looms larger than the present, not as inspiration, but as a reminder of what no longer exists. You are surrounded by ghosts that do not know they are dead. Rome had taught Britain how to be part of something bigger. When that something disappeared, Britain did not immediately know how to be small again. So it hovered in between, no longer Roman, not yet medieval. A world paused between identities, quietly shedding complexity like an unnecessary luxury. This was not the end of history. It was history holding its breath. And perhaps the most unsettling part is this. No one at the time knew they were living through a famous moment. There was no sense of we are witnessing the collapse of an era. People do not experience history that way. They experience it as weather, something that happens around them slowly without asking. Rome did not announce its departure. It just stopped showing up. And Britain woke up one morning in a world that looked the same and was already gone. This is where our story begins. In a land still full of Roman stones, Roman roads, Roman memories, yet drifting into a future that would forget who built them. A forgotten world, not because it was unimportant, but because it faded quietly. No one turned off the lights. They just stopped paying the bill. No Rome, no government, no one in charge. When Rome left Britain, it did not take the land with it. The hills remained. The rain, unfortunately, remained. The roads, the towns, the walls, all still there. What vanished was far less visible and far more important. Rome took the system, and without the system, everything else became decoration. For centuries, Roman rule had provided something deeply unnatural, but incredibly useful: predictability. Taxes were collected on schedule. Soldiers were paid to stand between danger and ordinary people. Officials existed whose entire job was to make sure things did not quietly fall apart. Rome was not loved, but it was dependable. You might complain about taxes, but at least you knew who to complain to. After Rome left, the complaints had nowhere to go. Roman law did not simply disappear overnight. Laws, like buildings, tend to linger after the people enforcing them are gone. But law without enforcement is more of a suggestion than a rule. Courts stopped functioning when there were no officials to run them. Written codes lost their authority when there was no higher power backing them up. Justice became local, personal, and uneven. The strong suddenly discovered they had excellent arguments. The weak discovered they did not. Taxes vanished first. This sounds on the surface like good news. No more tax collectors knocking on your door. No more contributions to distant emperors or abstract public projects. But taxes, inconvenient as they were, had paid for roads, bridges, defenses, and salaries. Without them, maintenance stopped. A bridge collapsing was no longer a civic emergency. It was just unfortunate. No more taxes, but also no more bridges. Progress has always been a package deal. The army went next. Roman soldiers had been a constant presence in Britain, sometimes oppressive, sometimes protective, always organized. When the legions withdrew, they left behind a vacuum that did not stay empty for long. Bandits, raiders, and ambitious local leaders noticed the silence immediately. Defense became a personal matter. If you wanted protection, you found someone strong enough to offer it, and you paid them in whatever you had. Security stopped being a public service and became a private arrangement. Officials disappeared quietly. There was no farewell tour for administrators, no final audit. One year there was a governor, the next year there wasn't. The paperwork stopped. The bureaucracy dissolved, not through rebellion, but through irrelevance. Without an empire behind them, titles meant nothing. Authority without backing is just confidence, and confidence only goes so far when no one is obligated to listen. For ordinary people, this shift was deeply disorienting. Most Britons under Roman rule had never governed themselves. Decisions had always come from above. Even village matters existed within a larger framework that stretched all the way to Rome itself. Suddenly, that framework was gone. Communities were left to solve problems they had never been trained to handle. The learning curve was steep, and mistakes were expensive. This was the moment Britain quietly slid from empire into improvisation. Power no longer flowed downward from a distant capital. It pooled wherever it could. A landowner with armed followers became important. A warrior with a reputation became influential. Leadership was no longer about legitimacy. It was about presence. If you could protect people or convince them you could, you became someone worth listening to. The irony is that many people likely felt relief at first. No more Roman demands, no more distant rulers, no more taxes. Freedom at last. But freedom without structure is a strange thing. It quickly turns into responsibility, and responsibility is far less popular. Roads do not repair themselves. Disputes do not resolve themselves. And when there is no referee, every disagreement risks becoming personal. Without Roman administration, even basic coordination became difficult. Trade slowed as standardized systems collapsed. Coinage became scarce. Barter returned, not as a romantic ideal, but as a necessity. Measuring value became subjective again. What was fair depended on who you were dealing with and how desperate you both were. Consistency, the quiet luxury of civilization, was gone. This transition did not happen uniformly. Some areas adapted better than others. Some communities managed to preserve fragments of Roman order, at least for a while. Others fragmented quickly, splintering into smaller, more isolated groups. Britain began to feel less like a province and more like a collection of disconnected worlds, each with its own rules, fears, and compromises. The absence of government did not mean the absence of power. It meant power changed shape. Instead of institutions, there were individuals. Instead of systems, there were relationships. Loyalty replaced law. Favors replaced rights. Survival depended less on citizenship and more on who knew your name. This was not chaos. It was something more subtle and more exhausting, constant negotiation. In this world, responsibility became optional and therefore rare. When something went wrong, there was no office to blame, no official to petition. Problems lingered, grievances festered. Violence became a solution, not because people were suddenly crueler, but because other solutions no longer worked. When words have no authority behind them, force starts to sound persuasive. There is a quiet cruelty in the loss of governance, not dramatic cruelty, not theatrical suffering, just the slow realization that no one is coming to help, that if something breaks, it stays broken. That fairness depends on strength. That order is no longer guaranteed. Rome had not just ruled Britain, it had absorbed responsibility for it. When Rome left, that responsibility was dumped back onto people who had never been asked to carry it. And yet, life continued. Fields were planted. Families grew. Children were born into a world where Rome was already a memory. They would never know what it felt like to live under a system that worked at scale. To them, the fragmented world they inherited felt normal. History rarely feels like loss when you have nothing to compare it to. This period marks a quiet but profound shift. Britain was no longer part of something vast and impersonal. It became intimate, local, and vulnerable. Decisions mattered more because they were closer. Mistakes hurt more because there was no buffer. The empire had provided distance between cause and effect, between ruler and ruled. Without it, everything moved closer together. There is a dark humor in how unceremonious it all was. An empire that once commanded the known world withdrew, and Britain was left to figure things out with no instructions. No exit interview, no handover notes, just silence. Rome did not collapse here. It simply stopped caring. And in that indifference, Britain learned a difficult lesson. Order is not natural. It must be maintained, paid for, and enforced. When no one is willing to do that work, the world does not end. It just becomes smaller, harsher, and far more personal. This was the space where everyday life would soon take center stage. Not emperors or generals, but farmers, families, and villages learning how to exist without a safety net. The age of empire was over. What followed was not glory or disaster, but something quieter. A world where everyone was responsible, and therefore no one truly was. When cities died and the countryside took over. As the machinery of empire fell silent, the cities of Rome and Britain began to do something strange. They did not burn, they did not collapse in dramatic ruin, they simply emptied, slowly, politely, as if everyone had agreed without ever meeting that it was time to go home. Roman cities were not organic places. They had been designed, imposed, and maintained by power. They existed because the empire needed them to exist. Administrators lived there. Soldiers passed through. Trade flowed in predictable patterns. Once those reasons faded, the cities lost their purpose. And a city without purpose is just an expensive collection of stone. People began to leave. Not all at once. Not in panic. One family moved back to the land their grandparents once worked. Another stopped repairing their roof and decided the countryside looked more forgiving. Shops closed because customers disappeared. Public spaces fell quiet because no one had business there anymore. The city did not die screaming. It died yawning. Streets that once echoed with carts and voices grew silent. Forums where laws had been announced now collected weeds. Bathhouses, symbols of Roman comfort and social life, became useless relics. Large cold buildings requiring effort no one could justify anymore. Heating them took fuel, maintaining them took organization. And organization by now was a scarce resource. The countryside, on the other hand, waited patiently. It always does. While cities depend on systems, the land depends on seasons. And seasons, at least, had not abandoned Britain. Fields still needed tending, animals still needed shelter, food still came from soil, not stone. As the imperial world shrank, people gravitated toward what was immediate, familiar, and necessary. Village life did not feel like progress. It felt like common sense. This was not a rejection of civilization. It was a retreat from complexity. Cities required coordination, water supply, waste removal, trade networks, governance. Villages required cooperation among people who knew each other's names. When large systems fail, small ones survive not because they are better, but because they are manageable. So Britain quietly reversed direction. Instead of moving toward urban life, people moved away from it. The countryside absorbed them, reshaping daily existence around land, labor, and local ties. Life became smaller in scale. The world shrank to walking distance. What mattered was no longer what happened in a distant capital, But what happened before nightfall? The physical landscape reflected this change. Stone buildings, once a sign of permanence and Roman ambition, were abandoned or dismantled. Their materials were reused where they could be. But stone is heavy and ambition had faded. Wood became the material of choice, easier to gather, easier to work, easier to replace. Wooden homes rose where stone houses had been left behind, less impressive but more practical. Roads told the same story. Roman roads had been engineered for movement, straight lines cutting across hills and valleys, defying the landscape rather than accommodating it. Without maintenance, they cracked. Stones loosened, drainage failed. Mud crept in. Over time, people stopped using them altogether, choosing instead the paths that made sense for their immediate needs. Straight lines gave way to winding tracks. Efficiency surrendered to familiarity. This was not decay in the moral sense, it was adaptation. The world after Rome did not need monumental architecture or perfect roads. It needed shelter, warmth, and food. People built what they could maintain, not what would impress. The future was no longer a grand project. It was tomorrow. There is something quietly sad about this transformation, but not tragic. Cities became shells, reminders of a life that no longer fit. People did not mourn them endlessly. You cannot live inside nostalgia. They accepted the change with a kind of weary pragmatism. The empire was gone. Complaining would not bring it back. Better to focus on what still worked. In villages, life slowed down. Not in a romantic way, just slower. Without schedules dictated by distant authorities, time became local again. Days were shaped by light, weather, and exhaustion. Seasons mattered more than years. The future extended as far as the next harvest. This was not a world obsessed with progress. It was a world focused on continuity. Social life tightened. In cities, anonymity had been possible. In villages, it was not. Everyone knew who belonged and who did not. Trust was personal. Reputation mattered. Cooperation was essential, not optional. Isolation could be deadly. This created a different kind of pressure. Not the bureaucratic pressure of empire, but the quiet weight of being known. The mood of this world was not despair, but resignation, a collective understanding that something vast had ended and something smaller had taken its place. People adjusted their expectations accordingly. Grand ideas faded. Survival became success. Stability became luxury. There is a gentle irony in how history labels this period as decline. For many people, leaving the city may have felt like relief. Urban life under Rome had not been easy. Taxes were heavy. Obligations were constant. Surveillance in its ancient form was real. The countryside offered distance from authority, what little authority remained. It offered autonomy, even if it came with risk. This was not a return to innocence. Violence, scarcity, and hardship existed everywhere. But the countryside allowed life to continue without pretending the empire still mattered. It was honest, in a way cities could no longer be. A wooden house did not lie about permanence. A muddy path did not promise connection to a wider world. Everything was exactly what it appeared to be. As cities emptied, they did not vanish immediately. They lingered on the edges of memory. Ruins stood as silent witnesses to a different rhythm of life. Children played among broken walls, unaware they were surrounded by history. The past became part of the landscape, no longer active, but not forgotten either. Britain was becoming something new by becoming something old, not by choice, but by necessity. The imperial experiment had ended, and what remained was the human baseline. Small communities, local concerns, and lives measured in effort rather than ambition. The countryside did not conquer the city. It outlasted it. And so the world grew quieter, not empty, just smaller, less certain of itself, less connected, but still alive, still moving forward one muddy step at a time. This was not the darkness yet. It was the long evening before night, when people adjust their eyes, lower their voices, and accept that tomorrow will look very much like today. A day in the life of a farmer, 450 AD. Morning does not arrive with an alarm. There is no bell, no schedule, no reminder buzzing insistently from the corner of the room. Morning arrives when light decides it is time, when the darkness thins just enough to make shapes recognizable, when the cold shifts slightly, when the animals begin to move. This is how the day begins in Britain around the year 450, not with intention but with habit. The farmer wakes before he wants to. He always does. Sleep here is shallow, practical, easily interrupted by cold, noise, or worry. The house, wooden, low, built more for shelter than comfort, holds the night inside it. Smoke lingers from last evening's fire. The air smells of earth, damp wool, and yesterday. He does not lie there thinking about the future. The future is too large. He thinks about what must be done before dark. He rises because staying in bed accomplishes nothing. Outside, the world is already waiting. Fields do not pause out of courtesy. Animals do not care how tired you are. Hunger is punctual. He pulls on the same clothes he wore yesterday, and the day before that, and the day before that. Fashion is not a concept here. If the fabric still holds together, it is good enough. The first task is simple and unavoidable. Check the animals. Livestock are wealth, insurance, food, and responsibility wrapped into one inconvenient package. They need feeding, they need watching, they need constant attention because loss is easy and replacement is not. A missing sheep is not an abstract problem. It is winter hunger several months from now, quietly announcing itself early. Then there is the field. Always the field. Farming in this world is not an occupation. It is a condition. The soil dictates the rhythm of life, and the rhythm is slow, repetitive, and unforgiving. There is no surplus of tools, no specialized equipment, just muscle, experience, and patience. The farmer works the land the way his parents did, and their parents before them. Innovation is rare, not because people lack imagination, but because mistakes are expensive. Time moves differently here. There is no calendar hanging on the wall, no neat division of days into labeled boxes. Time is measured in light and shadow, in seasons and exhaustion. Morning lasts until the sun reaches a certain height. Afternoon arrives when the body begins to feel heavy. Evening is announced by the cold creeping back in. This is not a life ruled by minutes. It is ruled by endurance. Food is simple because simplicity survives. Bread, coarse and heavy. Porridge. Occasionally meat when circumstances allow. Flavor is not the point. Energy is. Meals are repeated not out of boredom but reliability. Variety is a luxury that requires trade, stability, and surplus. None of those are guaranteed. Eating the same thing, day after day, is not depressing when you do not expect anything else. There is a strange comfort in repetition. When today looks like yesterday, it means yesterday did not kill you. In a world without guarantees, Survival itself becomes the quiet metric of success. If today is the same as yesterday, congratulations, you are still here. Much of the day is spent maintaining what already exists, fixing fences, reinforcing walls, clearing debris. This is not a culture obsessed with building new things. It is focused on keeping things from falling apart. Entropy is the real enemy here, and it is relentless. Every structure wants to collapse. Every tool wants to break. The farmer spends his life negotiating temporary victories against decay. There is no clear line between work and life. Everything is work, and work is life. Rest happens when the body insists on it. Leisure is not a category, but a moment, standing still for a breath, sharing a quiet word, watching the fire settle at night. Joy exists, but it is understated. Laughter comes easily and fades quickly. There is no time to linger on emotion, good or bad. Social interaction is limited and familiar. The village is small. Everyone knows everyone and has known them for years. Privacy is a modern invention. Here, lives overlap constantly. Cooperation is not idealistic, it is necessary. One bad harvest affects everyone. One conflict ripples outward. Harmony is practical, not philosophical. As the sun moves, the farmer adjusts. Tasks are done in the order that makes sense, not the order written down. Flexibility is survival. Plans change with the weather, the animals, the body. There is no concept of productivity metrics. The work is done when it must be done, or when exhaustion forces it to stop. There is also fear woven quietly into the day. Not dramatic fear, not constant terror, just an awareness that things can go wrong and often do. Injury can mean disaster, illness can spread, weather can betray. There is no safety net beyond family and neighbors, and even that net has limits. This awareness sharpens attention. Carelessness is a luxury. As evening approaches, the pace slows, not because the work is finished, but because light is fading. Darkness here is real darkness. No street lights, no glowing windows stretching into the night. When the sun goes down, the world contracts. The fire becomes the center of existence. Outside, shapes disappear. Inside, stories take their place. Dinner mirrors breakfast and yesterday's dinner before that. No one complains. Complaints do not change reality. Food is eaten with gratitude, not ceremony. The body needs fuel. The mind is already tired. Night is when thoughts wander briefly. There is time to remember things, stories of Rome, half understood, passed down from older generations, tales of roads that never ended, of cities full of sound and movement. These stories feel unreal, like dreams borrowed from someone else. The children listen without fully believing. This world, the small one they know, feels permanent to them. Sleep comes early because tomorrow will arrive the same way today did, with light, with cold, with work waiting patiently. There is no sense of wasting time because time is not something you manage. It is something you endure. This is not a life of constant misery. That idea comes from people who expect more. For those living it, this rhythm is normal. Hard, yes. Limited, absolutely. But familiar. The absence of choice simplifies things. You do what must be done. You do it again. You survive. From the outside, this life can look bleak. From the inside, it is simply life. Not heroic, not tragic, just persistent. The farmer does not think of himself as living in the aftermath of an empire. He thinks of himself as living through a day. One more day, successfully completed. And tomorrow, if it looks exactly the same, that is not failure. That is proof. Proof that the world, smaller and quieter though it may be, is still turning. Proof that in a forgotten age, ordinary people carried on, not with grand ambition, but with steady hands and lowered expectations. In this world, continuity is victory, and repetition is survival. Eating to survive, and surviving to eat the same thing again. Food in post-Roman Britain is not an experience. It is not an identity. It is not something you photograph, describe, or remember fondly years later. Food is a function. It answers a single question asked every day, sometimes twice a day. Are you still alive? If the answer is yes, then the food has done its job. There is no menu. There is no choice. Choice implies surplus, and surplus implies stability. What exists here instead is routine. Bread, coarse and dense, made from whatever grain could survive the soil and the weather. Porridge, endlessly adaptable, endlessly repeated. And beer, not the celebratory kind, but a weak, cloudy liquid that is safer to drink than water and just strong enough to remind you that fermentation is still one of humanity's better ideas. This is not famine life. That is an important distinction. Britain in the 5th century is poor, but not perpetually starving. Crops still grow. Animals still provide milk and meat, though not often. People eat regularly, just not extravagantly. Hunger exists, but it is usually quiet, manageable, familiar. The kind you live with, not the kind that kills you quickly. Bread is the cornerstone. It is heavy, dark, and filling. Made with minimal refinement, it carries more grit than grace. You chew it slowly, not for enjoyment, but necessity. It sits in the stomach like a promise. You will have the energy to work today. That is all it needs to be. Porridge follows close behind, grain boiled into submission, endlessly reliable. You can eat it hot or cold, thick or thin, alone or with whatever small additions happen to be available. It does not complain. It does not surprise you. It is the culinary embodiment of endurance. Beer plays a special role. It is not about pleasure, though it offers a hint of it. It is about safety. Clean water is unreliable. Fermented drink is predictable. Light beer consumed daily provides calories, hydration, and a mild escape from the monotony. It does not intoxicate so much as soften the edges of the day. Think less celebration, more emotional maintenance. Meals are repetitive because repetition works. The body adapts. The mind stops expecting novelty. There is a strange freedom in that. When you know exactly what you will eat tomorrow, you no longer waste energy thinking about it. Decision fatigue is a modern problem. Here, the decision has already been made by circumstance. Eating is not social theater. It is practical. Families eat together because it makes sense, not because it is ritualized. Conversation happens, but food does not demand attention. There are no courses, no pacing. You eat until the hunger quiets, then you stop. Satisfaction is measured in silence. Meat appears occasionally, usually tied to necessity rather than desire. An animal too old to be useful, a surplus that cannot be preserved indefinitely. Meat is welcomed but not expected. It is not the center of the diet. It is punctuation, not language. The absence of variety is not experienced as deprivation by those living it. Deprivation requires comparison. Most people in this world have never tasted what they are supposedly missing. There is no memory of exotic spices or distant flavors. The palate is shaped by environment, not aspiration. Pleasure comes from fullness, not novelty. There is something quietly ironic in how modern people romanticize or pity this diet. We imagine endless misery in eating the same food every day. But repetition can be comforting. Predictability reduces anxiety. When life is uncertain, routine becomes a form of stability. The food does not betray you. It shows up, does what it must, and leaves you able to continue. Cooking is simple and efficient. No elaborate preparation, no wasted fuel. Fire is valuable. Time is valuable. Meals are prepared with minimal effort, because effort must be saved for survival. Flavor exists, but subtly. Salt, when available, is precious. Herbs are practical rather than decorative. Taste is secondary to effect. There are no food critics, no regional cuisines proudly defended, no arguments about authenticity. There is only one standard. Does it sustain you? If yes, it is good. If no, it is a problem. This simplicity extends beyond the physical act of eating. Food is not tied to identity here. You are not what you eat, you are what you do. The modern obsession with diet as self-expression would seem bizarre in a world where eating is a biological obligation, not a statement. And yet small pleasures exist. A slightly better loaf. A warmer meal on a cold evening. A bit of honey, rarely. These moments matter because they are rare. Excess dulls appreciation. Scarcity sharpens it. Hunger, when it comes, is endured quietly. Complaining does not produce food. There is no audience for it. People adjust portions, stretch supplies, rely on each other. Hunger is not dramatic here. It is part of the background noise of life, rising and falling with the seasons. What food does more than anything else is anchor time. Meals divide the day. They mark progress. Morning eaten means work can begin. Evening eaten means survival has been achieved for another cycle. The repetition becomes a rhythm, and the rhythm becomes life. There is a calm brutality in this relationship with food. No illusions, no indulgence, just a clear understanding of cause and effect. Eat, work, work, eat, live, repeat. From the outside, it can sound bleak. From the inside, it is simply how the world works. There is no disappointment in not having what you never expected. The tragedy is not the simplicity of the diet. The tragedy would be losing the ability to sustain it. So they eat. The same bread, the same porridge, the same weak beer. Day after day, not joyfully, not bitterly, just steadily. And in doing so they continue. Which, in a world quietly slipping out of history, is achievement enough. No food reviews, no culinary pride. Just one lingering question at the end of every meal, silently answered by the body itself. Are you still standing? Superstition, prayers, and invisible fears. When the systems of the world fall apart, people do not stop looking for meaning. If anything, they look harder. In post-Roman Britain, as laws weakened and structures dissolved, belief quietly grew stronger, not more organized, not more refined, but more necessary. When nothing else could explain why things happened, the unseen stepped forward to fill the gap. Christianity did not vanish when Rome left. It lingered, much like the roads in the cities, stripped of its imperial polish but still present. Churches remained, though fewer. Priests still existed, though less educated, less connected, more local. But Christianity here was no longer the confident religion of an empire. It was humbler, more fragile, and increasingly blended with older beliefs that had never truly gone away. The old gods had been pushed aside, not erased. Names changed, symbols shifted, but habits endured. People prayed to Christ and saints, but also whispered to the land, the trees, the rivers. Sacred wells were still visited. Ancient rituals were quietly practiced alongside Christian prayers. Faith was practical, not ideological. You believed in whatever seemed to help. In a world without explanations, everything became a sign. Illness was not random, it was sent. A storm was not weather, it was a message. Death was not biology, it was judgment, warning, or fate. When cause and effect were unclear, intention filled the space. Something wanted this to happen. The question was who? Disease was especially terrifying. Without understanding germs or medicine, sickness arrived like an accusation. Why this person? Why now? Why this village? People searched for meaning because meaning felt safer than randomness. A curse could be countered. A punishment could be atoned for. Chaos offered no such comfort. Prayer became insurance. Not optimism, not certainty. Insurance. You prayed because not praying felt reckless. You prayed before travel, before planting, before birth. You prayed because you could, because it was something to do in a world where control was limited. Silence invited danger. Words, at least, made you feel involved. The night was where fear truly lived. Darkness here was absolute. No lamps in windows, no distant glow from neighboring towns. When the sun set, the world ended at the edge of firelight. Everything beyond that circle became imagination's territory. Forests were not scenic. They were threatening, dense, unmapped, and alive with sounds that refused explanation. A snapped branch could be an animal or something else. A shadow could be nothing or everything. The forest did not care which interpretation you chose, but your fear certainly did. There were no maps to reassure you, no signs to point the way. Getting lost was not metaphorical, it was fatal. Stories circulated, quietly reinforced by experience. People disappeared. Sometimes they were found, sometimes they were not. The forest kept its secrets, and people learned not to ask too many questions. Sounds at night were the worst, not screams or roars. Those would be too obvious. It was the subtle things, movement without shape, whispers without words, the wind sounding briefly like footsteps. The human mind is efficient at filling gaps, especially when survival depends on noticing threats. In this world, imagination was not indulgence. It was defense. Superstition was not foolishness. It was pattern recognition taken seriously. When you lack data, you rely on experience, stories, and intuition. If something bad happened after a certain behavior, you avoided that behavior. If something good followed a ritual, you repeated it. Logic was not absent here. It simply operated with different inputs. Charms were worn, amulets carried, words avoided, names spoken carefully. Certain days felt dangerous. Certain places felt wrong. These beliefs created a sense of order in an unpredictable world. They did not remove fear, but they organized it. Christian symbols offered comfort, but they did not erase older anxieties. The cross joined a crowded spiritual landscape. Saints replaced local spirits in name, but not always in function. Protection was the goal. Theology was secondary. Death, ever present, was never abstract. It happened at home, in the field, on the road, without warning. There were no hospitals to remove it from daily life. Bodies were washed, buried, remembered briefly, and then absorbed into routine. Grief existed, but it did not stop the world. The living still needed to eat. Because death was so familiar, the boundary between worlds felt thin. Dreams mattered. Omens mattered. A strange coincidence could change behavior for weeks. When the margin between survival and disaster is narrow, you do not dismiss anything lightly. And yet, this was not a world constantly screaming in terror. Fear settled into the background, like dampness in the air. You learned to live with it, to respect it, to structure your life around minimizing risk. Caution became virtue. Nighttime prayers were common, quiet, habitual, not desperate pleas, but acknowledgments. You spoke to whatever might be listening because it felt safer than silence. Faith was not always hopeful. Often it was transactional. Protection in exchange for obedience, survival in exchange for humility. There is a subtle, unsettling calm in this worldview. Not panic, not hysteria, just acceptance that the world is full of forces beyond understanding and that pretending otherwise is dangerous. Modern people fear uncertainty. These people expected it. Stories passed from mouth to mouth carried warnings, wrapped in narrative. Ghosts, spirits, monsters. These were not entertainment. They were memory, encoded. Do not go there. Do not do that. Do not travel alone at night. Fear preserved knowledge when writing failed. Listening to this world from a distance, it can sound primitive. But strip away modern explanations and the logic remains. When the lights go out, the imagination turns on. When systems fail, belief steps in. Not because people are foolish, but because they are human. This is why the night matters so much here. Darkness equalizes everything. Rich and poor disappear into shadow. Confidence fades. Firelight becomes precious. Conversation softens. The world feels closer and farther at the same time. This is the Britain of whispers and prayers, of signs and silences. Not a land ruled by terror, but one shaped by awareness of vulnerability. A place where belief filled the gaps left by collapsing institutions. Where fear was not an enemy to conquer, but a companion to manage. It is unsettling not because it is monstrous, but because it is quiet. Because nothing jumps out at you. Because the danger is rarely visible. Because the explanations are never complete. This is a world best understood in low light. When certainty fades and listening becomes instinct. And in that darkness, surrounded by unanswered questions, people did what they always have. They believed, they prayed, they watched the shadows, and they made it through the night. Warriors, warlords, and violence that felt ordinary. When the Roman army left Britain, it took more than shields and standards with it. It took the idea that violence could be organized, limited, and most importantly, controlled by someone else. What remained was not peace, but something quieter and far more intimate. Violence did not disappear. It moved closer to home. There were no professional armies anymore. No standardized training, no uniforms, no supply chains stretching across provinces. The age of soldiers who fought because it was their job ended quietly, like everything else. In its place emerged something simpler, older, and less predictable. Men with weapons, defending what they could, taking what they dared. In this world, power was no longer abstract. It was visible, audible, often heavy in the hand. Whoever owned weapons and knew how to use them held influence. Not authority in the Roman sense, but leverage. A sword did not make you noble, but it made people listen more carefully. Violence here was rarely dramatic. There were no massive campaigns, no decisive battles that would be remembered in textbooks. Instead, there were skirmishes, raids, ambushes, confrontations that began as arguments and ended as blood on the ground. Violence became a routine method of problem solving, not because people enjoyed it, but because alternatives were limited. A dispute over land, a stolen animal, an unpaid debt, a perceived insult. Without courts or officials, these issues did not escalate through paperwork. They escalated through presence. Someone showed up. Someone else responded. Words were exchanged. Weapons followed. The scale was small, but the consequences were real. This was not a land in constant war. That would require coordination. What Britain experienced instead was persistent insecurity, the sense that trouble could arrive any day from any direction wearing a familiar face. Your enemy was not a distant nation. It was the neighboring village. Sometimes it was your cousin. Warlords emerged not through formal titles, but reputation. A man who could fight, who had followers, who had proven himself capable of winning confrontations. These were the new centers of gravity. People gathered around strength, the way they once gathered around institutions. Protection was the currency. Loyalty was the price. These leaders were not kings in the later medieval sense. They did not rule territories with borders and laws. They controlled influence, a cluster of villages, a stretch of land. Their power depended on constant demonstration. Strength that rested grew weak. A warlord had to remind people periodically why listening to him was a good idea. For ordinary people, this meant living under a low, constant pressure. Not terror, not daily fighting, just awareness. You paid attention to who was strong. You adjusted your behavior accordingly. You avoided unnecessary conflict. You chose alliances carefully. Neutrality was not always an option. Weapons were simple and personal: spears, knives, axes, tools that doubled as instruments of survival and harm. There was no clear boundary between civilian and warrior. A farmer might fight in the morning and tend crops in the afternoon. Violence was not a separate profession. It was a skill that hovered in the background of daily life. This made it feel disturbingly normal. Children grew up watching men argue with weapons nearby. Stories of fights were told casually, not glorified, not hidden. Injury was expected. Death was possible. Everyone understood the rules, even if they did not like them. There is a strange understatement in how violence operated here. No speeches, no banners, no declarations, just action. Someone crossed a line, someone responded. Sometimes the matter ended quickly, sometimes it spiraled. Feuds formed, not out of ideology, but memory. An injury remembered becomes a reason. A reason becomes an excuse. And so it continues. The absence of large-scale war did not make this world safer. It made danger unpredictable. There was no front line, no warning. Violence blended into the fabric of life, indistinguishable from other risks like illness or weather. You planned for it the way you planned for winter. Humor, dark and understated, existed even here. People understood the absurdity of it. Not a war, they might say, just the neighbors asking questions. Everyone knew what that meant. Everyone knew it could end badly. But exaggeration felt unnecessary. Reality was already sharp enough. This normalization of violence did not mean people lacked morality. There were rules, unwritten but understood. Certain actions provoked stronger responses. Certain lines, once crossed, demanded retribution. Honor mattered, not as romance, but as stability. A reputation for fairness could be as powerful as a reputation for strength. Still, mistakes were common, misjudgments fatal. Violence does not need much encouragement when systems collapse. It fills space quickly, efficiently, and once present, it reshapes behavior. People walk differently, speak carefully, watch each other's hands. Yet even here life continued. Fields were worked, meals eaten, children raised. Violence did not define every moment. It simply hovered, a background hum, reminding everyone that safety was provisional. There is something deeply unsettling about how ordinary it all felt. No epic villain, no clear heroes, just people navigating a world where force had replaced process, where justice depended on strength, memory, and numbers. From the outside, it is tempting to judge, to label this age brutal, primitive, chaotic. But from within, it was simply reality adjusting to the absence of empire. When Rome left, it took the monopoly on violence with it. What followed was not anarchy, but redistribution. Everyone held a little bit of danger now. Everyone carried risk. Violence became smaller, closer, harder to avoid. Not world-ending, just personal. This is not the story of endless bloodshed. It is the story of how violence, stripped of ceremony and scale, became a tool of everyday negotiation. Quiet, familiar, unremarkable, and perhaps that is the most unsettling part. Not the battles that never happened, but the fights that did and were forgotten by everyone except those who survived them. Women, family, and the shortness of life. In the quiet world of post-Roman Britain, strength did not always look like armor or weapons. More often it looked like endurance. It looked like women waking before dawn, working until their bodies insisted on rest, and doing it again the next day without expecting recognition. History rarely pauses for them, but without them, nothing in this world would have continued at all. Women worked, not occasionally, not symbolically, constantly. There was no clear division between men's labor and women's labor when survival was at stake. Women planted, harvested, gathered, carried water, tended animals, prepared food, repaired clothing, and raised children, often simultaneously. Labor was not gendered by ideology. It was assigned by necessity. This was heavy work, physical, repetitive, exhausting. Bodies wore down quickly, hands hardened early. Strength was not optional, it was developed through routine. There were no excuses carved out for fragility. Pregnancy did not pause the world. Childbirth did not come with safety nets. Life moved forward, indifferent to individual strain. Marriage came early, not because of romance, but practicality. Families needed alliances. Labor needed to be organized. Children needed stability, however fragile that stability might be. Youth was not extended here. Childhood ended quickly, and adulthood arrived without ceremony. There was no long period of self-discovery. You discovered yourself by doing what needed to be done. Partnership was less about passion and more about function. Could you work together? Could you survive together? Love, when it existed, was quiet and unremarkable. It lived in shared effort, not grand gestures. Expectations were low, which may have been a mercy. Disappointment thrives on fantasy, and fantasy had little room to grow here. Families were large when they could be, not out of optimism, but calculation. High infant mortality meant not all children would survive. This reality was not hidden or softened. It was understood. Grief existed, but it was compressed, folded into daily life because stopping was rarely an option. You mourned while working. You remembered while moving forward. Children grew up surrounded by this acceptance. Death was not abstract. It happened nearby, often. Grandparents were rare. Elders were respected because they were exceptional. Longevity was achievement, not expectation. Reaching old age was a quiet victory over a world that offered few protections. Women bore the weight of this fragility most directly. Childbirth was dangerous. Complications were common. Survival was uncertain. Yet life continued because it had to. Courage here was not loud. It did not announce itself. It showed up every day, steady and unremarkable. Despite the hardship, this was not a culture of constant despair. People adapted emotionally as much as physically. When death is familiar, it loses some of its shock. That does not mean it hurts less, but it hurts differently. Grief becomes something you carry, not something that stops you. There is a temptation to view this world through modern lenses and see only suffering, but that misses something essential. People here did not measure their lives against future possibilities. They measured them against yesterday. If today was manageable, that was enough. Women held families together not through authority, but presence. They were the continuity in a world that changed constantly. When power shifted, when violence disrupted, when uncertainty grew, family remained the most reliable structure available, and women were at its center. Knowledge passed through them, practical knowledge, how to preserve food, how to care for the sick, how to recognize danger early. This wisdom was not written down. It lived in habit, observation, repetition. It was invisible to chroniclers, but vital to survival. Short lifespans shaped priorities. There was little sense in planning far ahead. The future was narrow, uncertain. What mattered was maintaining what existed, keeping children alive, keeping the household functioning. Dreams were modest because modest dreams were achievable. This does not mean there was no joy. Joy existed in moments, a healthy child, a successful harvest, a quiet evening without incident. Happiness was not a permanent state. It was a brief alignment of circumstances, appreciated while it lasted. Women's identities were deeply tied to family, not because of ideology, but because family was the primary unit of survival. Individualism had little space to grow here. The self was understood in relation to others. Isolation was dangerous. Belonging was protective. There is something deeply resilient in this worldview. When you expect little, you are rarely disappointed. When you understand life as fragile, you do not waste energy pretending otherwise. Strength comes from acceptance, not denial. The shortness of life did not make it meaningless. It made it immediate. There was urgency, but not panic. A focus on the present, not because of philosophical insight, but necessity. Tomorrow was never guaranteed. Today had to count. From the outside, this can feel unbearably heavy. From the inside, it was simply the way things were. People did not spend time wishing for a different world. Wishing does not plant crops or keep children warm. Action does. Women in this world were not symbols. They were not archetypes. They were individuals navigating limited options with quiet determination. Their lives rarely intersected with grand events, but they formed the foundation on which everything else rested. This is not a story of victimhood. It is a story of persistence, of lives lived fully within constraint, of strength expressed not through conquest, but continuation. In a forgotten age where empires faded and structures collapsed, it was this silent resilience that carried the world forward, not loudly, not gloriously, just steadily, from one short life to the next. A world that did not know it was being forgotten. No one in 5th century Britain woke up and thought, "We are living in the Dark Ages." That label would come much later, applied gently and then carelessly by people who had the luxury of hindsight. For those living through it, there was no darkness to name, no era to define. There was only today, and the quiet assumption that tomorrow would demand the same effort. History, as it turns out, is very bad at capturing what life feels like from the inside. It prefers moments, not routines. It remembers collapses, not adjustments. And so the people of post-Roman Britain slipped between the lines, not because nothing happened, but because nothing dramatic happened all at once. They did not know Rome was gone, not in the way we mean it. Rome had simply become irrelevant, a memory that no longer paid dividends, a story that did not help with planting or protection. When something stops affecting your daily decisions, it stops being real, no matter how impressive it once was. People did not live with the awareness of decline. Decline requires comparison. Most people had never seen Rome, never touched the empire directly. They inherited fragments, not the whole. To them, this world was not smaller than before. It was just the world. Children grew up assuming that villages were how life worked, that roads faded into mud, that power belonged to whoever stood closest with a weapon. They did not miss what they had never experienced. Nostalgia belongs to those who remember. For everyone else, reality sets the baseline. This is the uncomfortable truth history rarely admits. Most people do not experience history as change. They experience it as continuity under slightly altered conditions. The farmer plants again, the family eats again. The village negotiates another dispute. Life does not pause to acknowledge that something important has been lost. From our perspective, it feels tragic. We see what came before, we know what is missing. We see literacy decline, cities empty, trade networks collapse. We call it regression. But to those living there, it was adaptation. They were not moving backward. They were moving inward. The concept of progress is invisible when survival is the priority. Progress assumes a future you can plan for. This world did not promise that. It offered only repetition, and repetition, when it keeps you alive, feels sufficient. They did not think of themselves as forgotten. Forgotten by whom? The empire that left them, the future that had not yet arrived? Forgetting implies an audience, These people lived without one. Their lives were not performances, they were processes. History would later describe this era with a certain disappointment. Fewer records, simpler tools, less art, as if value could be measured by output alone. But the absence of records does not mean the absence of meaning. It means meaning existed where no one thought to write it down. Think about how much of modern life goes undocumented. The quiet evenings, the small kindnesses, the unremarkable endurance. Now remove the technology that records even that. What remains still matters even if no one remembers it. The people of this world were not waiting for a renaissance. They did not know they were between chapters. They did not feel like a bridge to something better. They felt like the present, complete, demanding, enough. This is what makes the idea of the Dark Ages misleading. Darkness implies ignorance, confusion, stagnation. But ignorance of what? Confusion compared to whom? These people understood their world intimately. They knew the land, the weather, the risks, the relationships that mattered. Their knowledge was narrow but deep. They did not debate philosophy because philosophy does not fix roofs. They did not write histories because memory lived in people, not pages. They did not build monuments because monuments do not feed children. Their priorities were not lower, they were closer. History tends to reward scale, empires, wars, inventions. It struggles with small lives lived consistently, the kind of lives that do not change the world, but prevent it from collapsing entirely. Britain, after Rome, did not innovate its way forward. It endured its way through. There is a quiet dignity in that, not the loud dignity of conquest, but the stubborn dignity of continuation, of refusing to disappear simply because the spotlight moved on. When later generations looked back, they saw absence, fewer texts, fewer buildings, fewer connections, and they filled that absence with judgment. Darkness is easier to label than silence. But silence does not mean nothing happened. It means history was happening at a scale we are not trained to notice. At the scale of meals, seasons, births, and deaths. At the scale of ordinary people doing ordinary things under extraordinary pressure. The irony is that this world was not unaware. It was intensely aware. Of fragility, of risk, of limits. It did not assume tomorrow would be better. It hoped tomorrow would simply arrive. This mindset changes everything. When improvement is not guaranteed, maintenance becomes success. When growth is uncertain, stability becomes ambition. When memory is short, presence becomes everything. Late at night, in a quiet village, with the fire low and the world pressed in by darkness, no one wondered how historians would judge them. They wondered if the roof would hold, if the child would survive the winter, if the neighbor would keep their word. These questions mattered. Everything else was abstract. History calls them forgotten because it does not know what to do with lives that leave no trace. But forgetting is a choice made by those who come later. These people did not forget themselves. They lived fully inside the only time they had. If you listen closely past the empires and the dates, you can still hear them. Not loudly, not urgently, just the sound of life continuing when no one is watching. This is the unsettling thought to sit with late at night, that most of history is not dramatic, that most lives are not remembered. That meaning does not depend on being recorded. They lived because the next day still required living. And in doing so, they carried the world forward, quietly, without knowing they were standing in the long shadow between eras. History would eventually move on and give this time a name, but they never needed one. They were not living in darkness. They were living in life. When history whispers instead of shouting. If you stand far enough back, history often looks like a series of explosions. Empires rise in thunder. They fall in flames. Dates are marked by battles, assassinations, dramatic endings that feel clean and decisive. But Britain after Rome refuses to fit that shape. There is no single moment you can point to and say, this is when it ended. Because it didn't. It didn't end at all. It slowly, quietly became something else. Britain did not collapse. It contracted. The buildings did not all fall down at once. People did not suddenly forget how to live. The land did not rebel. Instead, complexity drained away. Systems stopped working. Connections loosened. Expectations lowered. What remained was not ruin, but reduction. A world trimmed down to what could be sustained without empire. From the outside, this looks like failure. From the inside, it felt like adjustment. Rome had brought scale. Britain after Rome chose intimacy, not by philosophy but necessity. When you cannot maintain large structures, you stop building them. When you cannot rely on distant authority, you rely on people you can see. The world shrank to the size of a village, then to the size of a household, then sometimes to the size of a single fire on a cold night. There was nothing glorious about this process, no triumph, no heroic narrative to pass down. That is precisely why it is so human. Most lives are lived without spectacle. Most change happens quietly through small decisions made under pressure. Britain after Rome was not dramatic history. It was lived history. And because it lacked drama, it slipped out of memory. Later generations would look back and see gaps. Fewer records, simpler tools, smaller ambitions. They would call it darkness, as if something had gone wrong, as if the people living then had failed to live up to some invisible standard. But standards belong to those with the privilege to imagine alternatives. These people were not failing, they were surviving. This world did not disappear because it was conquered. No enemy marched in to erase it. It faded because no one kept writing about it, because its stories were spoken, not recorded, because its victories were quiet. Another winter endured, another child raised, another day completed. History tends to remember noise. It forgets endurance. Britain after Rome was deeply human in that way. Messy, uneven, grounded. It was a world where people mattered more than systems because systems no longer worked, where relationships carried weight, where memory lived in faces, not books, where meaning was local, immediate, and fragile. It is tempting to feel pity for this world, to see only what it lacked. But pity assumes superiority. It assumes that complexity always improves life. The people living then might have disagreed. They knew the costs of empire. They lived under its taxes, its demands, its distance. When it left, something was lost, but something else was gained. Autonomy, however dangerous, simplicity, however limiting. There is a quiet irony in how history frames this period. We call it forgotten, yet we are the ones who forgot how to listen. The evidence is still there, in the roads that vanish into fields, in the ruins absorbed by villages, in the rhythms of rural life that would persist for centuries. This world did not vanish. It dissolved into what came next. That is perhaps the most unsettling thought of all. Not that civilizations end, but that they rarely announce it. They do not always burn. Some simply stop expanding, stop recording, stop believing they are permanent. And one day, long after they are gone, someone else names their absence. Britain after Rome teaches us something uncomfortable about ourselves. We like stories with beginnings and endings. We like clear arcs. But most of life exists in between, in the long middle where nothing seems to happen, yet everything is changing. This was a world without an audience. No one was watching, no one was applauding, no one was taking notes. And still people lived. They loved when they could. They feared when they had to. They worked, ate, believed, fought, prayed, and slept. Over and over again. Not because it was meaningful in some grand sense, but because life insists on itself. Late at night, when the world feels smaller and quieter, this story lands differently. It does not demand excitement. It invites reflection. It asks you to consider how much of your own life would survive if the systems you rely on disappeared. How much of what you consider essential is actually optional. How much meaning exists without recognition. History whispers here. It does not shout. It does not celebrate itself. It does not explain itself. It simply exists, waiting for someone patient enough to listen. Britain after Rome was not a tragedy. It was not a triumph. It was a transition lived by ordinary people who did not know they were standing in a historical gap. They did not know they were being left behind by narratives that prefer noise to silence. They just knew that tomorrow would arrive, and they would need to be ready. And that perhaps is the final lesson of this forgotten world, that civilizations do not always die in fire. Some fade like breath on cold air, visible for a moment, then gone, not erased, just no longer noticed. Not every ending is loud. Not every fall is violent. Some worlds do not collapse. They simply grow quiet. Not every civilization dies in flames. Some just dim, like a hearth fire at midnight, slowly losing light while the house sleeps on, unaware that morning will come to a very different world.